4:30 in the morning, the Strait of Hormuz. The destroyer USS Mason was already at battle stations, moving at 22 knots through the dark water. The crew had been on high alert for 6 hours, and the standard merchant traffic lanes ahead of them were far too crowded for a Tuesday morning in the pre-dawn window. The heavy, humid air over the Persian Gulf carried the sharp smell of salt and unburnt diesel fuel from the coastal routes. The deck of the destroyer shuddered continuously as the bow cut through the short, choppy swells, pushing toward the open ocean. USS Mason was leading a two-ship surface action group, accompanied by the destroyer USS Rafael Peralta, 3,000 meters off her starboard quarter. Their position was exactly 26 degrees 30 minutes north, 56 degrees 15 minutes east. They were navigating the inbound lane of the traffic separation scheme, hemmed in by Iranian territorial waters to the north and Omani waters to the south. The navigable channel here was less than 2 miles wide. On the bridge of USS Mason, the tactical action officer stood behind the main consoles, watching the digital representation of the strait. The screens of the AN/SPY-6 radar were clustered with green icons. Over 40 separate contacts were drifting in the immediate vicinity of the transit corridor. Every single one of them was broadcasting a valid civilian automatic identification system signature. The digital tags identified them as Omani and Iranian commercial fishing dhows, moving slowly at speeds between 4 and 6 knots. The Fifth Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated 3 days prior, had assessed Iranian automatic identification system spoofing capabilities as strictly experimental and non-operational outside of laboratory conditions. Based on that specific intelligence, the dozens of contacts painting on the monitors were cataloged as standard civilian interference. The system designated them as non-combatants, masking their true nature behind perfectly formatted maritime identification numbers. Down in the Combat Information Center of USS Mason, the acoustic operators listened to the hydrophone feeds, trying to isolate the distinct high-pitched whine of military outboard motors from the low, rhythmic thrum of commercial diesel engines. The sheer volume of acoustic noise in the shallow, warm water made passive sonar classification highly difficult. The thermocline layer was warped by the intense surface heat of the previous day, bending the sound waves and creating false acoustic shadows. Every weapon system on USS Mason was fully energized and waiting in a defensive posture. The forward and aft Mark 41 vertical launch systems held a mixed load of standard missiles and evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, their digital links constantly refreshing with target data from the main array. Above the bridge, the Phalanx close-in weapon system rotated slowly on its mount, performing automated tracking cycles. The ammunition feed systems were primed with 20mm armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds. The crew at the consoles monitored the cooling pumps and power feeds, reading the numeric displays as the warship sliced through the humid night. At 4:45 in the morning, the distance to the largest cluster of civilian fishing dhows dropped to 8 nautical miles. The commanding officer of USS Mason ordered a course correction to port, shifting the destroyer 5 degrees to maintain a wider buffer zone between the warship and the merchant traffic. The ship heeled slightly. The massive gas turbine engines adjusted their pitch, a deep vibration traveling through the hull plates. Behind them, USS Rafael Peralta mirrored the maneuver flawlessly, maintaining the defensive screen. On the bridge wings, the forward lookout strained against the darkness, using high-powered thermal optics to cut through the sea haze. The thermal imaging showed small, wooden and fiberglass hulls bobbing in the current. There were no visible weapons, no radar masts, and no aggressive maneuvering. The civilian vessels appeared completely benign, adhering strictly to the patterns of local fishermen dragging nets in the early morning tide. But the spacing of the vessels was perfectly uniform. Instead of grouping in random clusters over fishing shoals, the 40 contacts had formed a loose, mathematically precise horseshoe shape directly across the projected path of the American destroyers. The distance closed to 6 nautical miles. The tactical action officer requested permission to broadcast a standard Marine Band advisory, warning the vessels to clear the transit lane. The communications officer keyed the microphone, transmitting on channel 16. He read the standardized warning in English and Farsi, stating the position, course, and speed of the United States Navy warships and demanding that all civilian traffic maintain a minimum distance of 3,000 meters. The radio channel hissed with static. There was no acknowledgement from the fishing fleet. The contacts continued to drift, their false civilian identification tags burning brightly on the main radar displays of the Combat Information Center. The clock rolled to exactly 4:55 in the morning. The sky over the Zagros Mountains to the north was just beginning to shift from black to a bruised, heavy purple. The air temperature was already 85 degrees, with humidity holding near 90%. The sea surface in the Strait of Hormuz was slick and heavy, rolling with short, steep swells that slapped constantly against the gray steel hulls of the American warships. USS Mason and USS Rafael Peralta pushed relentlessly through the inbound lane, leaving thick white wakes that churned the dark water. On the weather decks of USS Mason, the gunners manning the twin 50 caliber machine gun mounts wiped thick condensation from their thermal optics. The sailors wore heavy ballistic helmets and body armor over their fire-retardant coveralls, sweat already pooling at their collars. They tracked the small, bobbing contacts through their sights, waiting for a definitive visual identification. The targets were exactly 5 nautical miles out, hovering on the very edge of the thermal imaging envelope in the pre-dawn haze. Above the bridge, the long-range acoustic device was pivoted on its motorized mount, aiming directly at the center of the horseshoe formation ahead of them. The non-lethal sonic weapon was primed to deliver a highly directional beam of sound capable of causing intense physical pain and permanent hearing damage at close range. The communications officer on the bridge triggered the device, sending a series of piercing, modulated warning tones blasting across the open water. The sound was loud enough to vibrate the reinforced glass of the bridge windows, a synthetic scream designed to scatter any legitimate civilian traffic. The 40 contacts on the radar screen did not scatter. They held their exact positions, maintaining the mathematically precise blockade across the transit lane. In the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer leaned over the main console, analyzing the digital tracks. The system was still reading the contacts as legitimate Omani and Iranian commercial dhows, dutifully displaying their civilian registry numbers. The Fifth Fleet intelligence assessment regarding the spoofing technology was proving definitively wrong with every passing minute, but the ship's computer systems were still bound by the false data. The automated threat evaluation program refused to classify the fishing vessels as hostile, requiring the crew to manually override the defensive protocols to prepare the automated guns. Down in the sonar room, the acoustic operators pressed their headsets tight against their ears, fighting through the ambient noise of the shallow gulf. The thermocline layer was still scrambling the deep water signals, but the surface noise was finally clearing as the physical distance shrank. The lead operator adjusted his filters, isolating a specific frequency spike from the center of the formation. It was not the slow, heavy rhythm of a commercial diesel engine pulling a fishing net. The hydrophones were picking up the high-pitched, synchronized whine of multiple high-performance outboard motors idling in neutral. The acoustic signature was cross-referenced against the onboard digital library. It was a perfect match for the Blade Runner-class fast attack craft, heavily favored by the Iranian coastal defense forces. The tactical action officer immediately passed the acoustic identification up to the bridge. The commanding officer of USS Mason ordered the crew to establish a definitive threat posture. On the weather decks, the starboard and port gunners were ordered to load and make ready. The harsh, metallic clack of heavy ammunition belts feeding into the receivers of the 50 caliber machine guns echoed sharply against the exterior bulkheads. The safety levers were snapped down. 3,000 meters behind USS Mason, USS Rafael Peralta mirrored the escalation. The trailing destroyer shifted its course slightly to starboard, opening up its firing arcs to provide overlapping fields of fire. The Mark 41 vertical launch systems on both ships were fully energized, though surface-to-air missiles were useless against small wooden boats at point-blank range. The primary defense would fall to the deck guns, the close-in weapon systems, and the 5-inch main batteries sitting on the bows. The distance dropped to 4 nautical miles. The warships were moving at 22 knots, meaning they would physically collide with the blockade in exactly 11 minutes if neither side altered course. The digital tags on the AN/SPY-6 radar screens suddenly flickered, the civilian identification numbers blinking erratically, as the spoofed signals began to degrade under the intense electronic scrutiny of the approaching destroyers. The clock on the bulkhead rolled to exactly 5 in the morning. At exactly 5 minutes past 5 in the morning, the digital illusion evaporated. All 40 civilian automatic identification system tags winking on the AN/SPY-6 radar screens vanished simultaneously. The raw radar returns, stripped of their false metadata, suddenly bloomed across the consoles. The physical contacts had not moved from their mathematically precise horseshoe formation, but their speed vectors instantly tripled. The 40 hulls surged forward, their massive outboard engines throttling up to maximum output. They were moving at 45 knots, turning the dark water white behind them as they abandoned the pretense of being local fishermen. The tactical action officer in the Combat Information Center did not hesitate. The sudden, coordinated acceleration of 40 unregistered vessels directly toward a United States warship constituted an undeniable hostile act. He declared the swarm a severe and immediate threat, lifting the restrictive engagement protocols that had kept the defensive weapons in check. The automated threat evaluation system, finally freed from the spoofed civilian data that had blinded it for the last hour, immediately categorized all 40 contacts as hostile fast attack craft and began assigning priority targets to the ship's defensive grid. On the weather decks, the sun finally crested the jagged peaks of the Iranian coastline to the north, throwing harsh, flat light across the strait. The thermal optics on the 50 caliber machine gun mounts automatically switched to daytime magnification. The American gunners could clearly see the incoming vessels now. They were not wooden dhows. They were low-profile, fiberglass Blade Runner hulls painted a disruptive gray to blend with the sea surface. Heavy machine guns were bolted to the forward decks, and crews in dark tactical gear were bracing against the violent motion of the high-speed transit. USS Rafael Peralta pushed its speed to 28 knots, sliding outward to the starboard side to establish a clear, unobstructed field of fire. The 5-inch deck guns on both destroyers slewed aggressively toward the incoming swarm. The massive hydraulic motors whined loudly as the barrels depressed to their lowest possible angle. The heavy guns were designed to kill enemy warships at 20 miles, not to intercept fiberglass speedboats at 2 miles, but the tactical computers were already calculating the ballistic trajectories for proximity-fused fragmentation rounds, designed to airburst over the small boats and shred them with shrapnel. The distance was now 3 nautical miles. The swarm executed a synchronized maneuver, splitting into 4 distinct groups of 10 boats each. 2 groups maintained a direct frontal assault on USS Mason, while the other 2 groups swung wide, attempting to flank the destroyers and attack from the port and starboard sides simultaneously. The high-pitched scream of 80 high-performance outboard motors merged into a continuous, deafening roar that rolled across the surface of the Persian Gulf, completely drowning out the heavy, mechanical hum of the destroyer's gas turbines. The water of the strait was boiling with intersecting wakes. The Iranian fast boats were incredibly agile, bouncing violently over the 3-foot swells and throwing sheets of spray into the heavy morning air. The optical cameras on the destroyer's mast zoomed in on the lead flanking group. The crews on the small boats were visibly lifting shoulder-fired rocket launchers, trying to acquire a stable lock on the massive steel superstructure of the American warship. The sheer asymmetry of the engagement was jarring. 40 tiny, unarmored speedboats charging directly at 2 9,000-ton guided missile destroyers. But at this point-blank range, a single lucky hit from a rocket-propelled grenade could blind the ship's sensor arrays, destroy a communication antenna, or ignite the aviation fuel lines running beneath the flight deck. The heat of the morning was already baking the steel decks of the warship, mixing with the sharp scent of the synthetic gun lubricant applied hours earlier by the armory crews. The close-in weapon system mounted above the bridge tracked violently back and forth, its 6-barreled rotary cannon following the erratic movements of the lead attack boat. The targeting software was fully locked, waiting only for the distance to close to its maximum effective range of 2,000 meters. On the bridge, the commanding officer of USS Mason gripped the reinforced railing, his eyes locked on the white water churning directly ahead of his ship. He authorized the tactical action officer to open fire with all available surface-to-surface defensive weapon systems the moment the first enemy vessel crossed the 2-mile line. The tactical action officer watched the range ring on the main digital display shrink with terrifying speed. 2.5 miles, 2.2 miles, 2.1 miles. The moment the range ring on the digital display collapsed to exactly 2 miles, the engagement began. The tactical action officer aboard USS Mason gave the authorization. The 5-inch main battery on the bow of the destroyer fired. The massive gun mount recoiled backward, sending a physical shockwave through the steel decks that vibrated all the way up to the bridge windows. The early morning sun cast long, distorted shadows across the Persian Gulf, painting the churning water in harsh, flat light as the heavy naval artillery round left the barrel. 3 seconds later, USS Rafael Peralta opened fire from the starboard flank. The 5-inch rounds were not designed to strike the small boats directly. They were programmed by the combat computers to airburst. The first round from USS Mason detonated 50 feet above the lead group of Blade Runner fast attack craft. The explosion threw a dense, cone-shaped cloud of tungsten fragments downward at supersonic speed. 2 of the fiberglass hulls were shredded instantly. The boats did not explode. They simply disintegrated under the kinetic impact, the high-performance outboard motors tearing free and sinking instantly, while the shattered hulls flipped violently end over end into the wake. But the remaining 38 boats did not turn back. They broke their rigid, mathematical formation, accelerating into a chaotic, weaving sprint that threw massive walls of white spray into the humid air. They used the 3-foot swells to mask their profiles, bouncing erratically to throw off the automated targeting computers of the destroyers. In the Combat Information Center of USS Mason, the radar operators were actively fighting their own software. The ghost tracks from the spoofed civilian automatic identification system had corrupted the short-term memory of the threat evaluation computers. The system was struggling to assign continuous firing priorities to the erratic, high-speed targets, because the processing algorithms were still attempting to reconcile the combat data with the commercial fishing registry numbers it had ingested 10 minutes earlier. The tactical action officer had to isolate the tracking sectors manually, overriding the computer to force the automated weapon mounts to engage the closest threats. At exactly 1.5 miles, the Iranian crews opened fire. Heavy machine gun tracers skipped across the surface of the strait, glowing bright red against the dark water. The rounds began to strike the armored hull plates of USS Mason, sounding like a relentless hailstorm of heavy iron hammers. Sparks showered across the weather decks as the armor-piercing bullets gouged deep into the gray maritime paint. The American .50 caliber gunners immediately returned fire. The side decks of both destroyers erupted in continuous, deafening bursts. The gunners gripped the spade grips tightly, their bodies vibrating with the brutal, mechanical recoil of the heavy weapons. The thick, white smoke from the barrels was instantly whipped away by the 22-knot apparent wind generated by the ship's forward movement. The acrid smell of burning synthetic lubricant and hot brass filled the heavy morning air. Above the bridge of USS Mason, the close-in weapon system activated. The 6-barreled rotary cannon spun up with a deep, mechanical growl, tracking a cluster of 4 boats that had managed to flank the airbursts from the main gun. The system fired a burst of 200 armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds in 3 seconds. The depleted uranium penetrators cut a perfectly straight, churning line across the water, walking through the swells and intersecting the lead attack boat. The vessel was cut entirely in half, its fuel tank detonating in a bright, oily fireball that scorched the surface of the sea. The distance dropped to 1 mile. The swarm was now inside the minimum effective range of the main 5-inch batteries. The heavy deck guns could no longer depress their barrels low enough to track the fast-moving targets darting around the massive steel hulls. The defense of the warships now rested entirely on the automated rotary cannons and the sailors manning the manual machine guns. The noise was absolute. The deep roar of the gas turbine engines, the continuous hammering of the heavy machine guns, and the screaming outboard motors of the surviving Iranian boats merged into a chaotic, overwhelming wall of sound. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched a group of 5 attack boats swing aggressively toward the port side. They were moving at 45 knots, attempting to slide under the firing arc of the forward rotary cannon. The lead boat carried a heavy steel tripod mounted directly behind the cockpit. The operator in the back of the boat was locking a multiple-launch rocket system into position, aiming directly at the center mass of the American destroyer. The rotary cannon of the close-in weapon system shifted its tracking vector in a fraction of a second. Before the operator on the Iranian fast attack boat could pull the firing lanyard on the rocket pod, a continuous stream of 20mm depleted uranium rounds punched straight through the fiberglass hull. The boat disintegrated into a cloud of splinters and vaporized fuel, the unfired rockets sinking instantly into the churned water. The starboard radar housing of USS Mason vanished in a blinding white flash that blew the heavy steel plating violently inward. The impact had come from a steep vertical angle, entirely bypassing the surface-focused defensive screens. A Shahed-class loitering munition had been flying a pre-programmed terminal dive, launched 30 minutes earlier from a coastal launcher hidden in the Zagros Mountains, its small acoustic and radar signature perfectly masked by the deafening roar of the 80 outboard motors swarming below. The tactical action officer was thrown hard against the main tactical console by the overpressure wave, his heavy headset ripped away as the physical shock rolled through the Armored Combat Information Center. In the 10 seconds following the strike, 4 secondary tactical screens went completely black, and the sharp chemical bite of burning wiring insulation rapidly filled the compartment. The primary defense of the warship had been fundamentally misdirected. The spoofed civilian automatic identification system signals from the fishing dhows had not simply been a way to close the distance. The digital illusion had successfully forced the powerful AN/SPY-6 radar arrays to dedicate their processing power to the surface layer, leaving a momentary blind spot in the low-altitude airspace directly above the swarm. The drone had slipped through that exact gap. Sirens wailed across the weather decks of the American destroyer. The commanding officer held his footing on the bridge, immediately calling for damage reports. The primary hull was completely intact, and the ship was still making 22 knots. But the secondary communications array and a portion of the electronic warfare suite had been crushed by the blast. 3,000 meters to the starboard side, USS Rafael Peralta increased its rate of fire. The 5-inch main battery slammed another proximity-fused round into the air, detonating directly over the second flanking group of attack boats. The tungsten shrapnel cut down 3 more vessels in rapid succession. The heavy 50 caliber machine guns on both destroyers maintained a relentless, hammering rhythm, pouring hundreds of armor-piercing rounds into the water. The Iranian swarm commanders realized the window of vulnerability had closed. They had delivered their kinetic strike, using the fast boats as a chaotic shield for the loitering munition. The remaining 28 Blade Runner hulls executed a sharp, synchronized turn toward the north, throttling their massive outboard motors to push past 50 knots. They were breaking off the engagement, scattering widely to make targeting by the automated rotary cannons impossible as they fled back toward the shallow, heavily mined waters of the Iranian coastline. On the bridge of USS Mason, the commanding officer did not order a pursuit. The narrow geography of the Strait of Hormuz strictly dictated their tactical movement. Turning the 9,000-ton warship to chase the speedboats would take them out of the dredged shipping channel and put them at immediate risk of running aground or striking a tethered naval mine. Below decks, the damage control repair lockers had already deployed their rapid response teams. Sailors wearing heavy silver proximity suits and self-contained breathing apparatus rushed through the narrow steel passageways. They dragged thick fire hoses up the steep ladders toward the starboard superstructure, moving with absolute, practiced discipline. The emergency lighting cast harsh red shadows against the bulkheads. The ship's internal ventilation system had automatically isolated the affected zones, shutting down the massive air handlers to starve the fire of oxygen. The tactical action officer pulled himself off the deck of the Combat Information Center. His left shoulder was bruised from the impact, but he immediately re-established his headset connection, shifting his frequency to the surviving secondary channels. The primary digital link with USS Rafael Peralta was still perfectly active, allowing the 2 warships to share a unified radar picture even with USS Mason suffering localized sensor blindness. The clock on the forward bulkhead read 5:15 in the morning. The engagement had lasted exactly 10 minutes. The smoke pouring from the damaged housing was thick, trailing behind the destroyer as it continued its push toward the open ocean. The American warships had survived the ambush, but the rules of engagement in the Persian Gulf had just permanently changed. The fire in the starboard superstructure of USS Mason burned with a fierce chemical intensity. The heavy gray smoke was instantly flattened by the 22-knot headwind, trailing behind the destroyer like a dark scar across the pale morning sky. Deep inside the hull, the Damage Control Assistant coordinated Repair Locker 3. Teams of sailors wearing heavy silver proximity suits and self-contained breathing apparatus fought their way up the narrow, angled ladders. They dragged thick, canvas-wrapped hoses, pumping thousands of gallons of firefighting foam directly into the crushed radar housing. The ambient temperature in the adjacent passageways had spiked to 140 degrees, and the air tasted strictly of vaporized copper and melted synthetic insulation. Despite the catastrophic kinetic hit to the secondary array, the warship did not drop its speed. The massive gas turbines continued to push the 9,000-ton hull through the Strait of Hormuz at a relentless 22 knots. In the Armored Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer wiped a thin layer of black soot from his primary display. His left arm was tightly bandaged, but he remained at his station. The computer screens had successfully rebooted, automatically rerouting the critical processing power through the surviving port-side data nodes and bypassing the severed electrical trunks. 3,000 meters away, USS Rafael Peralta immediately assumed the role of primary air defense coordinator for the Surface Action Group. The trailing destroyer accelerated to 26 knots, sliding seamlessly into a covering position that perfectly shielded USS Mason's damaged starboard quarter. The massive ANSPY-6 radar arrays on USS Rafael Peralta radiated at maximum power, pushing a dense cone of electromagnetic energy deep into Iranian airspace. The initial deception had worked perfectly, but it would not work again. The electronic warfare officers on both destroyers had permanently locked out the commercial maritime frequencies. They were no longer accepting or processing any automated identification system signals. Every single fishing dhow, oil tanker, and cargo ship within a 50-mile radius was now digitally stripped of its registry and treated as a completely unknown, potentially hostile contact. The radar systems hunted exclusively for the raw physical signatures of low-flying drones and fast attack craft, completely ignoring the digital tags. At 5:20 in the morning, the secure satellite communication link with the United States 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain illuminated the main tactical displays. The engagement had been monitored in real time by the operational commanders. The unprovoked, coordinated strike, utilizing both a surface swarm and a loitering munition, had crossed a critical strategic threshold. The rules of engagement for the Surface Action Group were immediately altered from strict unit self-defense to proactive suppression of enemy launch capabilities. High above the Gulf of Oman, an EA-18 Gulf Growler had been orbiting at 30,000 feet. The high-altitude electronic warfare platform had been scanning the electromagnetic spectrum, intercepting the telemetry signals bouncing between the Iranian drone and its launch controller during the terminal dive. The electronic warfare officers in the rear cockpit of the aircraft triangulated the source of the guidance signal in seconds. The target was a mobile command and control node hidden in a deep, rocky ravine in the Zagros Mountains, 35 miles inland from the coastal highway. The exact coordinates were beamed directly down to the combat computers of USS Rafael Peralta. The tactical action officer aboard USS Rafael Peralta accepted the secure data link. The digital track appeared as a pulsing red triangle over the topographic map of the Iranian coastline on his main screen. The commanding officer authorized a 2-missile strike package to eliminate the control node before it could launch a second wave of loitering munitions. On the forward weather deck of USS Rafael Peralta, the heavy steel hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system snapped open. The mechanical clank echoed sharply across the water, cutting through the low, constant roar of the gas turbines. Down in the magazine, the solid rocket boosters of 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles were electrically armed. The tactical computers fed the final terrain-following flight paths into the internal gyroscopes of the weapons, programming them to fly beneath the coastal radar nets. The first Tomahawk erupted from the launch cell. The solid rocket booster ignited with a deafening, tearing roar that shook the entire forward section of the destroyer. A massive column of white fire and gray smoke blasted straight up into the clear morning sky. The missile cleared the superstructure in a fraction of a second, pitching sharply to the north as its main turbofan engine kicked in and the booster fell away. 4 seconds later, the second Tomahawk launched, chasing the first weapon into the airspace over the Strait of Hormuz. The heavy smell of burnt rocket propellant washed over the bridge wings, thick and acrid in the humid air. The 2 cruise missiles dropped low, skimming only 50 feet above the dark swells of the Persian Gulf, as they pushed toward the jagged mountains of the coastline. The American destroyers had absorbed the first blow, but the heavy retaliation was already in the air. The 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles crossed the Iranian coastline exactly 3 minutes after launch. They flew at an altitude of barely 100 feet, using the rugged, uneven topography of the coastal cliffs to mask their approach from the early warning radar networks positioned further inland. Their turbofan engines pushed them at a sustained speed of 550 miles per hour. The internal terrain contour matching systems constantly compared the ground rushing beneath them with the digital maps loaded in their memory, adjusting their flight paths in microsecond increments. 35 miles inland, hidden deep within a steep, rocky ravine in the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian Coastal Defense Forces operated their mobile command and control node. The unit consisted of 4 heavy transport trucks parked under specialized camouflage netting designed to absorb thermal radiation. The operators inside the command modules were frantically trying to re-establish a secure data link. Their primary telemetry connection to the loitering munitions had become highly erratic the moment the American electronic warfare aircraft had jammed the localized frequencies over the strait. The first Tomahawk crested the ridgeline of the ravine and immediately initiated its terminal dive. It struck the center of the encampment at a steep, mathematically perfect angle. 1,000 pounds of high explosives detonated instantaneously. The sheer physical force of the shockwave turned the solid rock walls of the ravine into secondary shrapnel, shredding the thermal camouflage netting and instantly tearing apart the 2 primary communication trucks. 2 seconds later, the second Tomahawk struck the exact center of the smoking crater left by the first. The massive overpressure wave shattered the remaining transport trucks and triggered a localized landslide. The steep walls of the ravine collapsed inward, burying the entire command and control node under thousands of tons of fractured stone and burning dirt. The destruction of the facility was absolute. Back in the Strait of Hormuz, the tactical action officer aboard USS Rafael Peralta watched the electronic warfare monitors closely. The pulsing red triangle that represented the active enemy guidance signal abruptly vanished from the digital map. In the exact same moment, the 3 remaining Shahed-class loitering munitions that had been holding in a high-altitude orbit over the Iranian coast lost their remote piloting connections. Deprived of their target telemetry and unable to acquire the American destroyers independently, the drones defaulted to their fail-safe protocols. They spiraled blindly out of the sky, crashing unceremoniously into the empty waters of the Persian Gulf. On the bridge of USS Mason, the commanding officer received the confirmed battle damage assessment from the EA-18 Gulf Growler circling far above. The coastal launch capability in their immediate operational sector had been completely neutralized. The threat of a second coordinated drone strike was temporarily eliminated, but the warship was still physically crippled and navigating restricted waters. The combat computers on both destroyers finally complete a hard reset of their tracking algorithms. The false commercial registry numbers and the spoofed automatic identification system tags that had perfectly masked the initial fastboat swarm were permanently purged from the short-term memory banks. The digital illusion that had allowed the ambush to succeed was erased. The tactical screens were finally clear, showing only the raw, unfiltered radar returns of the jagged coastline. The surviving Iranian fast attack craft had retreated completely behind the safety of their heavily mined territorial waters. Down in the damaged starboard superstructure of USS Mason, the damage control assistant reported that the primary chemical fire was fully extinguished. The repair locker teams had successfully established hard structural boundaries around the blast zone, and were actively pumping thousands of gallons of spent firefighting foam over the side of the hull. The secondary radar housing was a total loss, crushed completely by the kinetic impact of the drone But the localized electrical fires within the severed wiring trunks had been smothered before they could spread to the internal missile magazines. The two warships maintained their rigid formation and their speed of 22 knots. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting harsh, blinding light across the churning surface of the strait. The remaining transit distance to the open, unrestricted waters of the Gulf of Oman was 30 nautical miles. They had survived the immediate ambush, but the transit corridor remained incredibly narrow. The digital clock on the main tactical console rolled to exactly 5:35 in the morning. 6 in the morning, the Persian Gulf. The sun was fully above the horizon, burning away the last of the pre-dawn haze and pushing the ambient air temperature past 90 degrees. The heavy humidity settled over the water like a wet blanket. USS Mason and USS Rafael Peralta continued their push toward the deep water of the Gulf of Oman, maintaining a rigid speed of 22 knots. The narrow, dredged transit corridor of the Strait of Hormuz was finally beginning to widen, as the jagged coastlines of Iran to the north and Oman to the south slowly peeled back. The engagement was over, but the adrenaline that had sustained the crew for the past hour was rapidly fading, leaving behind a cold, heavy exhaustion. On the weather decks of USS Mason, the damage control repair locker teams finally received the order to stand down from emergency response. The sailors slowly unsealed their heavy silver proximity suits, their fire-retardant coveralls soaked through with sweat. The starboard side of the superstructure was a scene of violent mechanical devastation. The secondary radar housing, a multi-million-dollar array of advanced sensors, had been reduced to a crushed, blackened crater of twisted steel and melted synthetic compounds. A thick layer of chemical firefighting foam covered the deck, slowly washing through the scuppers and trailing into the blue water of the ship's wake. The charred superstructure had stopped steaming, the blackened steel cooling in the heavy morning air. Down in the main medical bay, the true cost of the intelligence failure was being systematically tallied. Modifier 1 dictated that the United States forces had survived, but the physical toll was exact and irreversible. Petty Officer 3rd Class James Corlin, who had been manning the starboard optical tracking station when the Shahed-class loitering munitions struck, was lying motionless under the bright surgical lights. He had taken severe, jagged shrapnel wounds to his left shoulder and chest when the armored glass of the observation booth shattered inward under the massive overpressure wave. The ship's surgeon worked quietly, surrounded by the rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the heart monitors. Sitting on a gurney in the corner of the medical bay, the tactical action officer watched the surgical team work. His own left arm was heavily wrapped in white gauze to cover the deep lacerations he had sustained when he was thrown against the Combat Information Center consoles. He stared at the deck plates, the A3 philosophical weight of the morning settling squarely on his shoulders. The United States Navy had built its entire modern defensive doctrine around overwhelming technological superiority, layered missile defense, and unmatched early warning networks. USS Mason was a $2 billion apex predator of surface warfare. Yet, the Iranian coastal forces had successfully bypassed those massive defensive grids using consumer-grade commercial automatic identification system spoofers and a fleet of fiberglass boats. The digital illusion that had cloaked the swarm as innocent fishing DOs had created a fatal 10-second distraction. That brief electronic blindness had been enough to let a $20,000 disposable drone permanently cripple a major sensor node and nearly cost a young sailor his life. 3,000 meters off the starboard quarter, USS Rafael Peralta remained locked in a flawless defensive screen. Its massive AN/SPY-6 radar arrays continuously swept the airspace and the surface, radiating with intense electromagnetic power. The electronic warfare officers had permanently blacklisted every commercial maritime frequency in the region. They refused to trust a single digital signal broadcasting in the Persian Gulf. Any vessel that approached the formation, regardless of its transponder code, was now treated as a hostile threat until visually confirmed otherwise. The only sound left on the bridge of USS Mason was the deep, mechanical thrum of the gas turbines and the relentless wash of the sea against the hull. The VHF radio channels, normally packed with the chatter of commercial shipping traffic, were completely dead. The merchant tankers and cargo ships holding position outside the strait had listened to the unencrypted Marine band warnings and heard the rolling thunder of the naval artillery. The commercial fleet had entirely halted its transit, dropping anchor and refusing to enter the narrow corridor until the United States Fifth Fleet guaranteed the shipping lanes were clear. The commanding officer of USS Mason stepped out onto the port bridge wing. He felt the heavy, hot wind pulling at his uniform. He looked back at the ruined, blackened steel of the starboard housing, then out toward the open ocean ahead. They had 15 miles left until they crossed the boundary line into the Gulf of Oman. The immediate tactical survival of the warships was secured, but the illusion of absolute American invulnerability in the narrow coastal waters had been shattered. 6:30 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The color of the water slowly shifted from the muddy, churning green of the shallow coastal shelf to the deep, heavy blue of the open ocean. The immediate threat of the land-based anti-ship batteries faded as the jagged Iranian coastline receded behind the curvature of the earth. USS Mason and USS Rafael Peralta pushed into the unrestricted transit lanes, their massive gas turbine engines maintaining a steady, synchronized rhythm at 22 knots. The Surface Action Group had successfully completed its primary navigational objective, forcing its way through the most contested maritime choke point in the world. Down in the main medical bay of USS Mason, the surgical team stabilized Petty Officer 3rd Class James Corlin. The jagged steel shrapnel from the shattered observation booth had been extracted from his left shoulder, but the extensive tissue damage required immediate, high-level reconstructive surgery. The ship's medical officer authorized an emergency medical evacuation, requesting a heavy transport helicopter from the 5th Fleet Forward Operating Base in Bahrain to intercept the destroyer as soon as the flight deck was cleared of debris. 2 decks up, the engineering teams finalized their damage assessment. The starboard secondary radar housing was a total structural loss. The kinetic impact and the subsequent chemical fire had melted the internal processing nodes into unrecognizable blocks of fused plastic and scorched copper. A $20,000 disposable loitering munition had permanently blinded a multi-million-dollar sensor array on a $2 billion warship. The United States Navy had won the engagement, relying on the immense firepower of its deck guns and cruise missiles to destroy the surface swarm and the coastal command node, but the tactical victory felt incredibly hollow under the harsh morning sun. The philosophical weight of the morning settled over the Combat Information Center. The tactical action officer stood quietly before the main displays, his injured left arm resting in a tight sling. He watched the digital map of the region. The pre-mission intelligence assessments were not just wrong, they were fundamentally obsolete. The rules of naval engagement had been permanently rewritten in the span of 15 minutes. The signature weapon of the ambush had not been the fiberglass boats or the dive-bombing drone. The true weapon had been the digital illusion. By successfully spoofing the automatic identification system, the Iranian coastal forces had weaponized the International Commercial Maritime Registry. They had forced the American combat computers to see a deadly swarm of fast attack craft as a peaceful fleet of commercial fishing dhows. That specific deception had created the fatal 10-second window that allowed the drone to slip through the defensive grid. Because of that single intelligence failure, the United States Fifth Fleet could no longer trust the digital environment of the Persian Gulf. The electronic warfare officers on both destroyers maintained an absolute blackout on commercial tracking frequencies. To the combat computers of USS Mason and USS Rafael Peralta, there was no longer any such thing as a civilian vessel. Every radar contact, regardless of what its transponder broadcast, was now categorized as a potential hostile threat that required visual identification and targeting lock. That immediate, necessary defensive posture created a catastrophic strategic problem. Behind the American warships, the Strait of Hormuz was completely paralyzed. The radio channels remained dead. Over 40 massive commercial oil tankers, carrying tens of millions of barrels of crude oil meant for global markets, had completely stopped their engines. The civilian captains refused to enter the narrow transit corridor. They knew that the American radar operators were treating everything on the water as a target, and they knew the Iranian coastal forces were actively using civilian commercial traffic as a physical shield for their attack boats. The commanding officer of USS Mason stepped back into the bridge, looking at the silent, empty horizon. They had cleared the strait, but in doing so, the waterway had been effectively closed to the world. The physical smoke from the crushed starboard superstructure was finally beginning to thin in the headwind, but the geopolitical fallout was already radiating outward. The global energy markets were opening to the news of a contested, burning choke point, and the absolute maritime supremacy of the United States in the coastal waters of the Middle East had been permanently fractured.